Well, this week we will continue with our prolegomena. As I mentioned last week, prolegomena is a study of first things, sort of the preliminary things that we need to establish before we jump into our study of church history. My wife, Nicole, has been a teacher for about 10 years off and on. She taught in California in public schools, then she taught in Atlanta in a private school, and then she taught at a 600-year-old boarding school over in England. So she's kind of she's taught the whole gamut of varieties of schools. And she said one of the things that she was astounded by when she first started teaching is she realized, some teachers, some of my colleagues are lazy. Like, they don't actually care that much about students, or sometimes they're mean to each other. And, when you're a kid sitting in, as a student, you look and you just assume that, I think most people put teachers on such a high pedestal. Now, it's true that many teachers really are. There are so many who really love their students and really care about them. But it was interesting that she said, sometimes you find teachers that really don't care that much, and she was kind of amazed by that. And I would say the moment of my disillusionment, where I realized something, is after I finished my studies, I realized that church historians, even the best church historians, only know about that much of church history. When you're a freshman in college or even in high school, you look at your teacher, you look at your professor, and there's this part of you that assumes that they pretty much know everything that there is to know about their subject. And then when you do advanced study and you kind of get to that place where you are teaching, or you can teach on like a collegiate level, you realize that there's so little that you actually know about different fields. I know the field of science is very much like that even the most learned scientist in the world still only knows about that much. I had an interesting experience with a professor by the name of John Coffey. John Coffey was my external examiner when I finished my dissertation, and he's the world's leading Puritan scholar, and he happens to be an evangelical. And I noticed that he really was a very modest and humble man, and PhDs are not known for being modest and humble a lot of times, unfortunately. And I asked him, I said, Professor Coffey, you just know so much about your field, but you don't really feel like you need to show off or anything. And I'll never forget his response. He said, Nathan, the most learned expert in the world in any given subject only knows about that much of all that there is to know. And I think that's a very humble way of approaching the study of any subject. So I realized that even though I've spent years studying church history, I still only know, if John Coffey knows that much, then I know that much, So there's a vast storehouse of things out there to learn. Well, this morning we're going to continue with prolegomena. Last week, if you were here, you remember that we started out mainly exploring this question: what are the benefits of studying church history? I made a claim that the study of church history should be a part of every Christian's discipleship. For them to really grow up to maturity, there should be some time spent studying and understanding a little bit about what's happened in the past. And so we looked at the benefits of studying the subject, and then I made a few recommendations of resources, some books, and some audio that you can listen to. So this morning we're going to cover these 4 points. Number one, I want to give you my assumptions about the study of church history. Every historian has certain assumptions and presuppositions that they have when they go into the study of a subject. As we're going to see, no historian is perfectly objective. That's just not possible. So I'll be very upfront about my assumptions going in. Then I want to give us a few cautions that we need to be mindful of as we study church history. Thirdly, I'll give a very brief definition of what is church history, and then we'll look at the time periods of church history. That'll be our time today. So let's jump in to my assumptions. This is me trying to be as honest as I can about my own biases when we look at the subject. And this is the first assumption that I have, is that God is the Lord of history. There's almost a childlike way of saying this that goes like this: History is God's story or His story. History is His story, the story of God. And what that means is that I believe God is involved in every facet of history, right? So it isn't that God is this spectator just watching and waiting and kind of wishing upon a star and hoping that things are going to turn out okay in world history. But I am an unashamed providentialist. So that means that I believe that everything that happens under the domain and the dominion of God. Nothing happens outside of His care and His activity, that which He permits, that which He decrees, that which He allows. Now let's read from Isaiah, because I want you to see if that lines up with Isaiah says. This is the Lord speaking in Isaiah 46, where the Lord says, "To whom will you liken me and make me equal, and compare me, that we may be alike? Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me." Watch verse 10. "Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." Now, does that sound like a God who is subject to the vagaries of chance and of people's making decisions that could thwart his plan? I don't think so. This sounds very much to me like God is concerned with, and God is in control. He's in charge of history. Now, that isn't to say that he is involved in the exact same way, right? For example, I believe that God is in control of the fact that all of you are here today, right? I think God's in control of that. God's in control and in charge of every good thing that happens. But God's also in control and in charge of all the bad things that happen. But we have to be careful. What I'm not suggesting is that God is the creator or the author of evil. Christians for 2,000 years have seen that's not the depiction of God that we have in the Bible, that God goes into people's hearts and creates evil and forces them to do evil things. Okay? So we believe that He's in charge, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in exactly the same way. I would suggest that Isaiah's philosophy of history that we just read in Isaiah 46 is directly opposite to the view of most historians, including Paul Johnson. Have any of you ever read any books by Paul Johnson? He wrote a book called Intellectuals. He was a very good historian. I think his writings are worth reading. But I think Isaiah's understanding of time and what happens in time is different from Paul Johnson's, when Paul Johnson wrote that there are no inevitabilities in history. In fact, I would say that everything that happens under the control of God is inevitable, right? So I think Isaiah and Paul Johnson would part ways at that point. Secondly, this is my second assumption, is that church history is descriptive, not normative. So church history tells us what things were or what things happened, not what things should have happened. Does that make sense? So he's giving a description of what happened. It isn't that the things that happen in church history, we should use that as our model and say, well, we need to necessarily use that as our model. No, not at all. Just because something happened in church history, that doesn't necessarily make it binding on us. Like, for example, the fact that the church in the year 1512, for example, the Roman Church made certain decisions. That does not necessarily mean that it's binding on us. There's only one source of normative history, and what is that? Which book? The Scriptures, that's right. So the Scriptures are different. The Scriptures are different from every history book that's ever been written. Namely, that only biblical history is authoritative in terms of telling us that we should model ourselves and our lives after that which we find in Scripture. You see, there are times where men and women in church history did things that were right and that were biblical and godly, and we should appreciate those. But there were also times where men and women in church history got it very wrong and were very ungodly in the things that they did. And we need to own up to that as Christians. We must not whitewash history and pretend as if everybody who's ever named the name of Christ has only done good. That's not true at all. I mean, the pages of church history are splattered with blood that of Christians that have been shed, but also Christians who have shed other people's blood, right? So we should own up to that and be honest about it. Now, which branch of Christianity can you think of that would say that what happens in history or tradition is authoritative? In fact, it is as authoritative as what we find in Scripture. What would that be? The Roman Catholic Church. Yeah, the Eastern Orthodox Church would certainly have such a high view of tradition. In fact, if you ask an Eastern Orthodox priest or a lay person today, what's the essence of Eastern Orthodoxy? They will say tradition, tradition, tradition. I mean, that's what it's all about for them. Here's the way that I put it. Protestants, we believe in sola scriptura, not sola historia. Do you see? So it's the Bible alone. That is our authority. Not the Bible plus history. Not history alone is our standard. This is the way that I like to kind of summarize this. We believe things, I'm speaking for me. You don't have to have my view. I hope that you'll adopt it, but this is my view. We believe things because the Bible teaches them. We get encouraged when people in church history believe them and teach them. See, we believe things that are taught in the Bible, but we get excited. We should get encouraged when we see that people through the ages have honored God and what He says in His Word. Any questions about this so far? Okay, getting a little bit more deep, a little bit more philosophical, supposedly would be my third assumption. And it's this, that the Christian church lies at the center of human history. This very great church historian named Dr. Greg Singer, who was one of my dad's mentors. Did any of you look up Dr. Singer's lectures and listen to those? It would be worth your time. He was an absolutely brilliant historian. He said this about the history of the church. Every single event in human history, think about this, y'all. Get your minds in gear. I know it's early. I know it says it's 9:20. It's really only 8:20 for our bodies, right? Every single event in human history in some way reflects upon and bears upon the destiny of the church of the living God. The rise and fall of empires, political elections, the deaths of emperors, revolutions, they all have some impact on the church. They all derive meaning from the church. I think he means that in a certain sense. God gives history meaning. At the very center of the historical process is the church of the living God. Now, if this is right, I agree with him. And if this is right, that it means that we ought to evaluate things which happen in world history and in time in terms of their impact on the church of Jesus Christ. Now, I think that this is true because I believe that the Bible teaches that God is very concerned about the bride of Jesus Christ, the church. I mean, the church is the ultimate goal, Jesus securing for himself a bride, which we'll come to that in a little bit later. But does this make sense that the church, that world events and historical events ought to be viewed in their relation to the church of Jesus Christ? Well, consider it. It's deep, but it's worth considering. Here's my fourth assumption, is that the Christian church will prevail over every earthly opposition. Can you think of anywhere in the Bible that would support this, that would give credence to this idea? What are you thinking of, Judy?
The gates of hell shall not prevail against us.
You read my mind. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Jesus promises, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. That's a wonderful promise. That's a wonderful promise. Let me read. This is a long quote, but I love long quotes from Philip Schaff. This 19th century Swiss historian who I have great admiration for. He even writes it in somewhat of a poetic way, but I think it's very beautiful. Philip Schaff writes, Christianity has thus passed through many stages of its earthly life. It has outlived the destruction of Jerusalem, the dissolution of the Roman Empire, fierce persecutions from without, from outside, heretical corruptions from the inside, the barbarian invasion, the confusion of the Dark Ages, the papal tyranny, infidelity, the ravages of revolution, the attacks of enemies, and the errors of friends, the rise and fall of proud kingdoms, empires, and republics, philosophical systems, and social organizations without number. And behold, it still lives, and lives in greater strength and wider extent than ever, controlling the progress of civilization and the destinies of the world, marching over the ruins of human wisdom and folly, ever forward and onward, spreading silently its heavenly blessings from generation to generation and from country to country to the ends of the earth. It can never die. It will never see the decrepitude of old age, but like its divine founder, Jesus, it will live in the unfading freshness of self-renewing youth and the unbroken vigor of adulthood to the end of time, and will outlive time itself. Is that last expression true? Do you think the Church of Jesus Christ will outlive time itself? Oh, yeah. The church's destiny is the presence of God when time will be no more, to quote Revelation. And then lastly, he says, single denominations and sects, human forms of doctrine, government and worship, after having served their purpose, may disappear and go the way of all flesh. But the Church Universal of Christ, in her divine life and substance, is too strong for the gates of hell. She will only exchange her earthly garments. This is beautiful. She will only exchange her earthly garments for the wedding dress of the Lamb's bride, and rise from the state of humiliation to the state of exaltation and glory. Then at the coming of Christ, she will reap the final harvest of history, and as the church triumphant in heaven, celebrate and enjoy the eternal Sabbath of holiness and peace. This will be the endless end of history. Isn't that wonderful? I love that statement. And that gives me encouragement and it gives me hope. It really does. By the way, Richard, did you turn the mic on? You did? Okay, great. I love that so much. Because think of what that means if it's true. One thing that it means is that we should never, ever get completely discouraged with the state of the church. How many of you have ever been deeply discouraged by things that you see in other Christians or things that you see in the church? Everybody who's awake has their hand up. Yeah. I certainly have. And would you say that currently we're in a place of optimism and strength, or kind of pessimism and kind of decline in, let's just say, this country, in America in 2019? What would you say? I see one thumb going down. I see more thumbs going down. I agree with that. I think that's true. We'll come to much later in the course that it's areas south and east of here that have great potential and have great strength. You have to go down to South America and east to Africa, where you're seeing the greatest, numerically, you're seeing the greatest strength and vigor in the church. But no matter how hopeless at times things can seem to get with the bride of Jesus Christ, we have the promise of Jesus that ultimately the church will prevail through the power of Jesus Christ, the Lord of the church. When we come to the Middle Ages, it's going to be very dark. It's going to be very grim. I mean, from the time the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, and the barbarians just poured over the boundaries of Rome and eventually sacked Rome, and then sacked all these major cities in the former Roman Empire. The church is at a low ebb, and it continues that way for several hundred years. You have the Viking invasion, you have the Islamic invasion, you have the Mongols who came later in the Middle Ages, and the church is just pounded and beleaguered. And then out of this, you have this great strength of this one church that takes so much power for herself, namely the church centered in the city of Rome. And eventually this church starts to make these pronouncements that are so far from Jesus' ideal for the church and so far from what the Bible teaches that by the time you get into the late Middle Ages, you say, well, the flame is extinguished. But I heard someone, this was Ravi Zacharias many years ago, he said something, he was actually quoting another person who said that the gospel is more like a bird than a candle. When you have a candle that's blown on, it's extinguished and it goes out. The gospel is more like a bird that when a bird is approached and a bird shoos away, it isn't extinguished, but it goes and it sets down in another place. And I think we can say that about the gospel. I think we can say that about the church of Jesus. That the church will never be extinguished. There will be times when, like a bird, it will be spooked and it will fly to another place. And that's where the blessing of God will rest for a time. But ultimately, we can know that we have the promise of Jesus, that it is His divine power that will keep the church throughout all ages until the church takes on the wedding dress for the wedding feast and the wedding ceremony. Well, fifthly, Jesus Christ is the key to understanding history. The church is at the center of the purposes of God, but this is my fifth assumption that you need to know about, is that Jesus Christ is the key to understanding history. This will be my last long quote from Philip Schaff, but he writes this: Jesus Christ, the God-man, the prophet, priest, and king of mankind, is in fact the center and turning point, not only of chronology, but of all history, and the key to all its mysteries. Around Him, around Jesus, as the Son of the moral universe, revolve all nations and all important events in the religious life of the world, and all must, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, contribute to glorify His name and advance His cause. The history of mankind before His birth must be viewed as a preparation for His coming, and the history after His birth as a gradual diffusion of His Spirit and progress of His kingdom. All things were created by Him and for Him, as the Apostle Paul wrote. And He is the desire of all nations. He appears in the fullness of time, Mark 1:15 and Galatians 4:4, when the process of preparation was finished and the world's needs of redemption fully disclosed. So you might say that this is a Christocentric approach to history, to see Jesus as being at the center of not only the life of the church, but of the purposes of God all throughout the different eras of church history. So those are just a few of my assumptions that we will enter into this study with. Do you all have any questions, any objections, anything you'd like to add to the to these thoughts? Okay. Seeing none, let me give you a few cautions. It's worthwhile giving you a few cautions as we embark on a study of church history. The first one is this: is that perfectly unbiased history is not possible. So my goal as a historian is to be as fair with the evidence as I possibly can. I would like if history turned out differently. I would like if it just sided with that which I believe. You see what I mean? I would like if everything in history worked out the way that I think that it should have. Because I would have said, well, the PCA, would have existed since the Garden of Eden. I mean, if history worked out only the way that I wanted, well, that's not exactly true. A perfectly balanced teaching of history, it's not possible because everybody has their assumptions, their biases, their presuppositions. I just stated some of my presuppositions. I do think it is more possible to present a good, accurate picture of church history than some. I won't go into this too much, but are you all familiar with the term historiography? Historiography is the study of history, right? And so you have different theories that prevail in the study of history. You've got one school that will prevail for 50 or 100 or 5 years, and then you have a new one that comes up and displaces it. It almost sounds Hegelian. You have an idea, you have the counter idea, then you have the new idea, and that process continues on and on. Well, anyway, this happens very much in history. And with the onset of postmodernism, which I won't go into explaining very much of, but this idea of postmodernity that really anyone's view of history, a postmodern person would say that anybody who presents a view of history, the only reason that they're doing that is because they want to get some power through doing that. Does that make sense? So everything's a power grab in the postmodern view of the world. So we can't even talk about true, objective, this is what actually happened for a postmodern person. They would say you're just presenting your particular spin on it because there's some secret way you're trying to gain power for yourself. Now, I think this is a very cynical way of looking at the world and of trying to understand history. And I reject that. I'm not postmodern in my understanding of history. But the pendulum has swung that direction, but I think it's kind of swinging back in another direction where people are saying, look, okay, some balanced and fair history is certainly possible. And it's only the interpretation of historical events that are much fun and that are very interesting, right? So, I mean, everybody agrees that Martin Luther in the year 1517, he nailed these 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg in Germany. But what's interesting is not just that particular date on October 31st. What's interesting is the interpretation of that event. Was it a good event? Was it a bad event? Why was it good? Why do you think that it was bad? What was it that led up to Martin Luther doing that? What were the forces at work? Was it just Martin Luther's personal prejudice? You know, did he just decide one day that he hated the Catholic Church? Or were there political factors? What came after the Reformation? What were the forces at work there? What caused Luther to part ways with Zwingli at the Colloquy of Marburg in 1530? What were the things that led up to that and the things that flowed out of that? You see, that's what makes history interesting, not just saying the Colloquy of Marburg, 1530, and it's like, oh, boring, you know. So anyway, this is this is why it's relevant and it's important to understand some of these things. One principle that I try to adhere to, and I think this is a good life principle that everybody should adhere to, is we should avoid making our friends appear only good and our enemies appear only bad. Isn't that a universal human tendency, propensity, we might say? That anybody who agrees with us, we're going to do everything we can to make them look only good. And everybody who's our opponent in a certain matter, we're going to make them look only bad. Is that a fair way of approaching life or of approaching the study of history? No, it's not. It's not. I mean, there is some good that you can find in not almost every actor, but close to every actor in church history. There are certain good things, just as there are other bad things. Here's my second caution. And this is a big one. This is where people stumble when they read church history and they find out about, for example, Dr. Torquemada. You know who Torquemada was? He was the Grand Inquisitor, the Inquisition. These people would put people in vices and they would squeeze until they confessed whatever it was that the church wanted them to confess. The blood flowed. Or the Crusades. How is it that Pope, I think it was Urban II, he preached a crusade in 1095 and all of these Christians grabbed their swords and ran to the Holy Land, you know. It's so easy to look at something like that and to frankly be very arrogant and say, God forbid, what horrible, benighted people. I would have never been involved in that. But we have to be careful of, for one thing, we need to understand why did people do that? What motivated them? By the way, let me just state for the record, the Inquisition was horrible and it was evil. I'm not saying the Inquisition was good, but I am saying we need to at least understand why it was that the Roman Catholic Church and individual theologians thought that was an appropriate way to proceed. You know, one of the greatest minds in all of church history is named Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century. He wrote the Summa Theologica. It is this enormous systematic theology. He did, I think, a lot of good. He wrote some wonderful things, but he was a big supporter of the Inquisition. Now, when someone as genius as Thomas Aquinas is supporting something like the Inquisition, I think we should at least strive to understand and make a real effort to understand how was it that this person who was such a genius would support something like that, right? So I think that's the only way that we can do justice to people of the past. And so this is the caution. Be cautious when judging people in other eras by modern standards. Now, I have mentioned the burning of Servetus. If you were here, I just mentioned it very much in passing. There was a man by the name of Michael Servetus who came to Geneva, and he was arrested and he was burned. He was burned at the stake for heresy. And Calvin, John Calvin, approved of it. He said, now it wasn't only Calvin's decision, but Calvin and the consistory, the city council, the church council said, yes, you should be burned. And he was. And Calvin approved of it. This is kind of a black eye, I would say, on John Calvin's life. But listen to what somebody wrote. You'll find that I have a propensity for 19th century historians. This is another 19th century historian who gives us this caution. As we think about this episode of Calvin saying, yes, you should burn this guy for his heresy. This historian says, beware those who resolve to try men, put people on trial, right? To try men of the 16th century by rules and principles no one recognized before the 18th century, but indulge in the most extravagant invectives in setting forth their misdeeds, the misdeeds of the people in the 16th century, whereas if they themselves lived 3 centuries back, would not have been content to smite only with the tongue or the pen, but would eagerly have grasped the sword or the torch. You see what he's saying? He's saying, be very cautious, judging people in, for example, the 16th century by these modern standards. He's saying nobody thought in a modern way before the 18th century. Okay? He says not only that, he's being a little bit cheeky here. He's saying, in fact, it's very likely that if you lived then, you would have not just smote with your pen or your tongue, you would have picked up the sword and you would have put the fire to the flame, right? You would have put the flame to the pile of sticks to burn somebody. Maybe think of it this way. Don't think so highly of yourself. I shouldn't think so highly of myself to assume that if I lived then, I wouldn't have participated. There's a man by the name of Jordan Peterson. Are any of y'all familiar with him? He's come out in the last couple of years as a very powerful Canadian intellectual. And one of the things that he says a lot about, I've actually written an article about him. It's sitting in my desktop on my computer. I need to submit it and see if I can get it published. But one of the things that he's very fond of saying is going after people who look at communist states today, like in Cuba and Venezuela and China, and they look at that and they say, well, that's not true communism. Pure communism has never been tried. Have you ever heard this objection? When, let's say, someone who's not a communist or a socialist, maybe more a capitalist, looks at just how awful these countries are that are just dying under the hand of communism. And people say, well, but that's not true communism. Pure communism actually works. Jordan Peterson, he has these video clips where he goes after a person. He says, I've come to disdain people who say that, because what they really mean is that, well, even though it's never worked out well, I am noble enough that if I were the person implementing the pure communism, I would get it right. He says that is the epitome of arrogance, to put yourself on such a high pedestal to suggest that if you were the one implementing Marxism, then you would have gotten it right. It would be a merciful, bountiful, loving kingdom. He says you are so arrogant if you think that. And I think that ties in here, because it is arrogant of us to just assume that if we lived in the 1500s, we would have turned up our nose and said, Calvin, how dare you? Inquisitors, how dare you? So we have to be very careful. Then the same historian goes on to write these words. He's going to give a little explanation of why Servetus was killed. Just this will tide you over until we really get to the 16th century, and we'll talk about this at greater length. Let no one undertake to discuss this subject, the subject of Servetus' burning, who is so ignorant of history as not to know that in that day and throughout all Christendom, heresy, especially when joined with blasphemy, was a capital crime. Were you aware of that? Heresy in the 16th century was punishable by death everywhere. Then he continues, today even a child might detect the fallacy of the argument that heresy, which slays the soul, should have as dire a penalty as murder, which slays only the body. But the Roman Catholic, the Protestant, and the Socinian, think liberal. People who say, I'm a Christian, but they don't really believe all the stuff about the Bible and Jesus and the resurrection and heaven and hell. Catholic, Protestant, and the Socinian of the 16th century assented to this argument. According to the standard of the times, Servetus was a heretic. So even now, just with that one quote, does that help you maybe just a little bit more understand how that could have happened? Heresy was a crime, and everybody agreed. Roman Catholic, Protestant, and liberals or Socinians who denied the deity of Christ. Everybody believed that Servetus should have been burned. Incidentally, Philip Schaff goes on to lament. He says, it is just awful that Calvin is mainly known for Calvinism and for Servetus. He says this is a travesty because if you actually read Calvin, it is unbelievable the amount of spiritual benefit that anybody will get from it, Calvinist or Arminian. Calvin was a remarkable man, but let's try to be as gracious with Christians in the past as we will want Christians in the future to be gracious with us when they look back at our lives. Will there be a lot of areas where in 1 and 2 and 500 years, Christians will look back at us and shake their heads? You bet they will. You bet they will. We don't know what those things are, so we should remain humble. Getting a little bit more boots on the ground here. Theology impacts people for many generations. This is something that we should be cautious about as we study church history. In the 1960s, my grandfather retired. He worked for the Southern Railway for his whole career. He retired and he bought a little 1-acre tract of land in far western North Carolina near the Nantahala National Forest. And as you all know, I enjoy history, so I like studying local history about little pockets of land and things like that. And I wanted to learn about this area called Aquone, which is near Lake Nantahala, where my grandparents had this cabin. And I read something really interesting on this webpage that gives this local history of the area around Lake Nantahala. Any of you ever been to Lake Nantahala? Some of you, I know y'all filmed around there. In the river, yeah. So this is the lake, of course, that feeds the Nantahala River. Well, anyway, this is what I learned that I thought was so interesting. This is what this webpage describes. When the Indians were being rounded up for the Trail of Tears March, that was in the fall of 1838, there was a detainment center called Camp Scott near the mouth of Wine Spring Creek. The area is now covered by the water of Nantahala Lake. Now, the town that was in the bottom of the lake before they filled it up in the 40s was called Aquone. Aquone had a church, a school, a post office, and at least 2 stores and a corn mill. There was once a Campbellite church at Aquone, which is a member of the Christians known as the Disciples of Christ. Have you ever heard of the Campbellites? Have you ever heard of the Disciples of Christ? Have you ever heard of the Restoration Movement back in the 19th century? You had a group of churches. The Church of Christ were part of it, the Campbellites, the Disciples of Christ. Now, these churches, they believed they were restoring early true Christianity in the 19th century through a guy called Barton Stone and two brothers by the last name of Campbell. Thomas Campbell was one of them. And one of the distinctives that the Campbellite churches believed is that baptism saves you. So they believe that in what's known as baptismal regeneration, you have to be baptized with water to be saved. And these churches were right in this area called Aquone. In the 1970s and 80s, my dad, for years and years, had discussions with a man who lived next door to my grandparents up there in the mountains. And they got to be friends, my dad and this man. His name was Marvin Wilson. I remember him vividly. I remember meeting the man. And he and my dad talked endlessly about theology. And you know one of the things they talked about constantly? Whether baptism saves you. You know why? Because Marvin Wilson believed that your water baptism saves you. If you are not baptized with water, you will go to hell. Isn't that remarkable that 150 years later, this belief still had hold in this little valley in western North Carolina? Folks, theology matters, and it matters for generations. I was shocked when I read that, because I know about the Campbellite movement. I knew that was what they believed and what they taught. I said, my dad, Marvin Wilson, used to debate this all the time, and Marvin believed that one of the things that he would present to God when he died is, well, I got baptized. Is that enough? Some people get baptized multiple times. The first one didn't take. They say, I actually got baptized 3 times because it wasn't, I don't think I was pure-hearted enough when I got it. Well, we'll leave that aside, but do know that theology impacts people for many generations. Now, this next point has become a truism, kind of an aphorism, namely that history repeats itself. I have found this to be remarkably true. George Santayana, who is a historian in the latter part of the 1800s, early 1900s, he observed that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Have you all ever heard of this trope? It's pretty accurate as well. I think it's akin to the principle in the book of Ecclesiastes, this cycle that there's nothing new under the sun. That which has been is that which will be, and there is nothing new under the sun. We can never look at a thing and say, behold, this is new. No, things just come back again and again. They change labels, they change titles, but it's true that fundamentally things, we see them cycle through and come up again and again. There really is nothing new under the sun. I think this is true of so many movements. I mean, in different changes of, it's like the same person, they just change clothes. And you see these movements that go all throughout church history. You see liberalism in its different guises. Understand, I'm not talking about political liberalism. I'm talking about theological liberalism. The idea that, well, the Bible's, parts of it are inspired, but parts of it aren't. And, Jesus died on the cross. It was a good example for us, how to die well, as opposed to atoning for people's death. There's not really a heaven and a hell, those sorts of things. Arianism, Marcionism. We'll talk about Marcion in just a couple of weeks. And the trend I see right now is this new social gospel movement. The social gospel movement was something in the 19th century, but it's the idea that well, it's important to believe the truths of the faith, but what's really important is that we're taking care of people, we're feeding the hungry, we're clothing the poor, and things like that. And I think we're starting to see that come back around within evangelical circles. That is very distressing to me. So history has a way of repeating itself. Let me give you this will be very brief. It's just a sentence or two, but I'll give you my definition of church history. This is my own made-up definition, that it is the outworking of God's eternal plan to prepare a bride for Jesus Christ. Who is the bride of Christ? The church, yeah. So it's the unfolding or the outworking in time of this eternal decree, this eternal plan of God to prepare a bride for Christ. She will be beautiful when her Savior comes for her. She's not yet, but she will be. And I think of the life of the bride of Christ, the church. I think of that as something like the life of an individual Christian. I think there's a lot of parallels. Isn't it true that there are times where you're very strong in your faith, where things are going well, and you're firing on all cylinders? The Lord is very close and very near to you. Well, it's like that in the life of the church at times. And there are other times where we fall into sin, where the Lord seems distant and far away, and you wonder, are my prayers going above the ceiling right here? And it's like that also in the life of the church of Jesus Christ. There are times where we experience great peace, right? And there's just not harassment from outside, but it's like that with the church. There are times of peace, but there are also times where we're troubled and where there are outward difficulties that we face. So that's my definition of church history. Now we'll turn lastly to the time periods of church history. Church history is generally regarded as running from Pentecost in Acts 2 until the return of Christ. Okay, so most church history books start with Pentecost and say, this is the birth of the church of Jesus Christ, is Acts 2, and that runs all the way until the end of time. Whenever Jesus comes back, we do not know when Jesus will come back. Jesus himself, he did not know, said he didn't know when he would come back, so let's not bother trying to figure that out. Now, we could do, really focus in and think about this for a moment. I want to suggest that we could do a study of church history from the Garden of Eden all the way until the end of time. Now, one drawback to that is it would be a very long class. We'd just do it in a 5 to 12 year period, to study the movements of church history all throughout that time. But this is kind of a deep point. Think about it. What would that suppose, or what might that teach us if we were able to successfully show that that we could teach church history from the garden all the way to the end of time? Okay, yeah. There's one way to be saved. What else might it? Yes.
That God had a plan from the beginning.
There you go. Yeah. There's one way to be saved. God had a plan from the beginning. Wouldn't that be neat if we could show that there is actually continuity from the very beginning of time to the very end of time? That there have been believers in the true God, the only true God, from the very beginning of time all the way to the end of time. Now, folks, I believe that we could do that. We just don't have time. We're going to focus on church history starting in the year 100 A.D. We're not even going to go into Acts too much. I assume that all of you have read Acts and you have got the story nailed there. But do you see what how that might instruct us? The fact that there really is a continuity, that there really is a plan, Mrs. Boodhoo, all the way from the beginning to the end of time. Now, there are some who would disagree with that. They would say, nope, you can't do that because God has different plans. He has a plan for the Jews. He has a plan for the Gentiles. He has a plan for the Jews before the times of Moses and then after the time of Moses. And then the dispensation of this and the dispensation of that. So there are some who want to kind of divide up all of time and all of history a little bit too much for me. But I don't accept that. I think that there is an overarching plan of God. And I have unity in Jesus Christ with Adam and Eve. I believe that Adam and Eve were saved. After all, when God kicked them out of the garden, what did he clothe them with? Animal skins. It says God killed an animal and covered them in it. Clothed them and covered them. And we understand that as being a picture of us being clothed with the righteousness of Christ. Zechariah chapter 3 adds to that picture of being clothed with another person's righteousness. But think of it this way. The true church of Jesus Christ has existed from the Garden of Eden until the end of time. I really believe that that's an accurate and a helpful way of thinking about church history. The church has been present. I will say this, that we're living in the last days. I believe that. Some people believe there's going to be the last days, then more last days, and then the real last days. That's not what the New Testament says, I don't think. Hebrews chapter 1 says that God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. That last, it's eschaton. It's the last period of history. We have no idea how long it will be. It's been about 2,000 years because Jesus has not yet returned. It could be 100,000 years. We have no idea. Jesus could return tomorrow. We don't know when that will be. But the author of Hebrews says that we are living in the last days right now. And that's one of my assumptions as well. That means the final days are the final period of history. We have about 5 minutes left, so let's go to the fourfold division of church history, and I'm going to show you the actual classes that we're going to go through. Most people divide church history up into 4 eras, and I'm going to do that because it makes perfect sense. The first is ancient history. The second is medieval history. The third is Reformation history, and the fourth is modern church history. Okay, so ancient, medieval, Reformation, and modern. For some reason, we spend an inordinate amount of time from 1500 on. That's only 1/4 of church history, but that's really where a lot of action is. So there wasn't a whole lot happening through what are known as like the Dark Ages. Well, we'll talk about the Dark Ages later. So starting next week, we're going to begin with the Apostolic Fathers. I take the ancient church period from the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus in the year 33 AD, and then we'll go all the way to the year 451. Does anybody know what happened in 451 AD? What's that? Did someone say Chalcedon? If they did, that's exactly right. The Council of Chalcedon was the fourth ecumenical council. And so essentially this period of ancient church history, it takes us from the very beginnings of the church. It takes us from Pentecost all the way up to the time when we might say the Catholic Church has been formed. I'm not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. I'm talking about the universal body of Jesus Christ. So Catholic small c, if that makes sense, where you have established what it is that the Bible teaches about, for example, the deity of Jesus Christ. You have the canon that has been determined. It wasn't finally determined in 451, but there was a functional canon that happened hundreds of years before that. But Christianity has achieved legal status within the Roman Empire. So all these things have happened by the year 451. So the classes we'll do are next week, Apostolic Fathers, then early heresy and the emergence of Catholicity. It's really, that's kind of a misnomer. That should be a small Catholic, but I'll explain that when we get to it. We'll talk about persecution and the spread of Christianity. For off and on for the first several hundred years, Christians could not have done what we're doing. We're meeting in public. It's daylight, you know. We'll talk about what that persecution entailed. We'll talk about Christology. What is Christology? Is it theology of Chris? No, it is the study of Christ, right? Our doctrine of Jesus Christ. So we'll talk about early heresy and then down here later heresy, how we got the Bible. I'm very excited about this one. It's the question of the canon. How did we get the Bible that we have in our hand? Why do we have 27 books of the New Testament and not 37 or 59 or only 14? Well, we'll talk about that. And then arguably the most influential person in all of church history, so much good, some bad, would be Augustine, who was an African man and a theologian and a bishop in Hippo, which is in North Africa, not far from present-day Tunisia. Nicole and I visited Tunisia a few years ago on a cruise, and I really wanted to go over to Hippo, and they said, only if you want to get killed. I said, we'll hold off on that, maybe for another time. It's not a nice place to go now. So that'll be ancient church, then medieval church. What we'll see really is that there was this decline of the Roman Empire, and out of that decline came this great power that came to be known as the Roman Catholic Church throughout the Middle Ages. We'll look at 4 threats to the church and 1 myth. We're going to do some myth busting. If you've ever seen the show Mythbusters, we'll do that. We'll talk about Thomas Aquinas for 1 week. He's a very, very important theologian in the Middle Ages. And then we'll talk about the Renaissance and the pre-Reformers. There were people who wanted Reformation before Martin Luther, and we'll look at some of their lives. The third period of church history is the Reformation, which I'm dating from 1500 to the year 1792. We'll have 4 classes on that. Martin Luther and Lutheranism. Then we'll have John Calvin and Calvinism. Then the King's Great Matter. Anyone know what the King's Great Matter was? Well, you'll learn. The King's Great Matter and the Pure Ones. Anyone know what who the Pure Ones were? The Puritans. Very good. If you doubt that God is powerful, then this is evidence that I'm only devoting this much time to the Puritans when I want to do a whole class on the Puritans. God is very powerful in restraining me. And then we'll talk about the Great Awakening. The reason we're going to go until 1792, that sounds like a very arbitrary date, doesn't it? Well, the reasons are twofold. Number one is in 1792, William Carey published an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens, which is the longest book title in the history of the church. And it was his argument that we have got to start taking the gospel to the nations. As good as the Reformation was in getting theology right, it was not good in taking it out. And so in 1792, William Carey wrote that book. The next year, 1793, he founded the Baptist Missionary Society. And in that year, he left for India. And so that started the period of the modern modern missions movement is what it's known as. And the reason I'm using that as a dividing line is, number one, because of William Carey's influence and the fact that the modern missions movement has influenced church history right now in an enormous way. And secondly, that it was right around that time that this French awakening in a secular direction, which was known as the French Enlightenment. Yeah, you had the Revolution. Yeah, these things were all clustered together. You have the Revolution. You have the Enlightenment. Is the broadest term for the period, and so we'll use 1792 as the dividing line, and then modern church history from 1792 to the present. We'll focus on the Second Great Awakening and the beginnings of the evangelical movement within America. We'll talk about one French threat and one German threat to the Christian faith, fundamentalism and modernism, and then we'll look at the modern Christian church, past, present, and future. Now, believe it or not, so there'll be, I think, 18 or 19 classes after this. This is a sketch of a sketch of a sketch. It's going to be so frustrating having to cut so many things out that are really important. But I want to just give you like 18 coat pegs that you can hang a coat on. You can hang on in your mind and know that, okay, in this century, in this era, something important happened. And that way, if anyone you meet is a Thomist and they want to talk with you about Thomas Aquinas and debate his approach to theology, you'll be ready for a debate. All right. Any questions before we finish? Yes, Rich.
This discussion on presuppositions reminded me when I was trying to create a course for the church here on biblical archaeology. And what I discovered was that they moved away from the whole idea of biblical archaeology because they were afraid that the archaeology they were doing would not be accepted by the world of archaeology.
Yeah.
If they went to a place like Jericho, with the assumption that there were broken down walls there, and they did their digging with the object of finding those broken down walls, as opposed to the more scientific way of just uncovering what's at Jericho, seeing what's actually there, and placing an interpretation on it. The presupposition we're making in this course is so strong that entire history is the working out of God's plan. This is for the church.
Yeah.
This is not for historians.
Right. Yeah. That's true.
Sense. This is for us.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. At academic society meetings, I'm a member of different church history societies, and depending on the group, I would take a different approach. Because my goal there is I want to move history forward. But it is interesting that even in those meetings where you're supposed to be objective and scientific, as balanced and unbiased historians, it's very difficult for those underlying assumptions to not show themselves. It's the difference if you say this is what happened versus this is what happened and it's great and it glorifies God. You tend to not do this in society meetings, but since I'm teaching, not in a professional setting, this will be the way that I'm going to approach it. So.
But our presupposition is what might be called a whopper.
Right. Yeah, it's a big one. Oh, it's a big one. Although I would say it's Jesus's. So I'm going to hide behind his robe and say, I think this was Jesus's assumption as well. So, yeah. Now, by the way, that field would be known as ancient Near Eastern archaeology. It wouldn't just be biblical. It would be kind of taking thought for the scope of that whole area known as the ancient Near East. Yeah. Any other questions or objections? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming.